Hello, everyone, and welcome to this installment of our AGU Webinars Professional Development Series, featuring Robert Pincus, Editor-in-Chief of James, the Journal of Advances in Modeling Earth Systems. I'm Nathaniel Janik, Career Services Coordinator at AGU, and I'll be your host for today's webinar, which will provide tips for a successful manuscript submission. A few things to go over before we begin. If you have questions during the presentation today, please type them into the question box in the right side control panel, and we will answer as many as we can at the conclusion of the presentation. The slides for today's presentation are also available on your GoToWebinar dashboard. Just find the Handouts tab, and you'll be able to download it from there at any point during the presentation. And I'll also make those available when we send out the recording later on this week. Once again, presenting today's webinar is Robert Pincus. In addition to being the Editor-in-Chief of James, he also works with Series, which is a NOAA collaboration with NOAA and the Colorado University Boulder, and you'll have to correct me if I'm wrong there, Robert. Before I pass it over to Robert, though, we do want to start with poll, and our first poll is: where do you identify with the following list? Do you identify as a graduate student, undergraduate student, early career scientist, or established scientist? And I'll launch the poll now, so go ahead and answer. And I'll keep it open for a few moments. And I'm going to close in 3, 2, 1. And it looks like we've got 46% identify as early career scientists, 39% identify as grad students, 12% are established scientists, and there are 2% of our audience is starting their career early, and they're trying to figure out how the manuscript submission process works ahead of the game. These 2% are undergrad students. We're going to launch one more poll here, just to start off, so that Robert can get a sense of who's here. So, yeah, have you ever submitted a paper? Yes, I've submitted a paper before. No, I have never submitted a paper, and I am presently preparing my first manuscript submission. So I will wait a few more moments before closing this poll. And 3, 2, 1. And it looks like I've got 81% had submitted a paper before, 13% are presently working on their first manuscript submission, and 6% have never submitted a paper, but I'm sure that 6% is moving closer to that 13% with every day. All right, with that, I'm going to pass it to you, Robert. Take it away. I think you might still be on mute.
Sorry, my mistake. How's that?
Oh, no problem. Welcome.
Okay, great. Welcome, everyone. Thanks for your interest in publishing, and in publishing particularly with AGU. As Nathaniel said, I'm the Editor-in-Chief of one of AGU's smaller journals and one of the open access journals, so that's the Journal of Advances in Modeling Earth Systems. And so we focus on, well, modeling Earth systems, so basically, numerical modeling primarily of the physical climate system and its components. I am gonna, they gave me a bunch of slides to talk about, and I went completely off script and prepared my own, because I tried to ask myself, what does it mean to prepare a successful manuscript submission? And as far as I'm concerned, that means that everybody stays happy through this process. And so I want to focus on what it takes to be a happy author. And that would be you. So the first thing to recognize is that when you are preparing a manuscript for submission, you're preparing to be part of the scientific community. And so you want to understand what the expectations are of that scientific community. And I mean this not like in your local sense of what your group does or what your advisors group does or right this, but the broader scientific community that you're going to engage with by writing and explaining the work that you're doing. It's important that you understand what those communities' expectations are. And so there's a lot of material, a lot of this, some of it put out by AGU, but a lot of it put out by broader scientific organizations. It's useful to look at both the publications website from AGU and the ethics website, and we'll come back a little bit to ethics in a sec. There are materials, for instance, from the National Academy of Sciences that talk about a lot of this stuff too, so how to, this guide on conducting research. So these are really meant more, not for me to talk about, but just so that you have these resources. And I would encourage you to sort of look at them as questions arise. One of the main thrusts in publication these days, one of the main places that you'll get feedback from reviewers and from your editors is in reproducibility. So it's not that we necessarily need to be able to reproduce your figure to the last decimal place, but it's that we'd like to understand that the ideas that you're presenting are robust. And so if, for example, you deal with samples, with rocks or other such samples, well, so in general, you want to prepare your work to be reproducible. And you want to think about how that's going to look long before you get ready to write the paper, because we will ask you to demonstrate that your research is reproducible when, not even when we review it, but when you send it to us. And so that means, so there's this copdesk.org, which is trying to work across disciplines to establish what they like to call best practices. And I'll talk about some specific things to the geosciences on the next slide. One thing to keep in mind is it's less true in the atmospheric sciences where I work, but it's certainly true in geophysics and geology, is that you often work with industry partners. And it's very important, and I know this from my own experience, it's very important to be very clear up front about intellectual property. Your university, if that's where you work, will have lawyers and other people to help you establish intellectual property. But if you are collaborating with industry folks and they do not have clearance to set their data free, you will not be able to publish it. So this is another place where you want to sort of keep your eye on what will be reproducible and accessible from the get-go. The AGU, like most publishers, has what they call a data policy, and this is basically meant to ensure that your data is available for other people to examine, again, to sort of foster this question about, to foster reproducibility of studies. And so reproducible means not only can people see if they get the same results, but also that they can build on what you've done rather than having to reinvent everything that you have started with. This is the AGU's position statement. You'll notice that it references that copdesk.org. I think the specifics of this are useful, but from my perspective as an editor, what I want more than anything very specific and more than a checklist is for you to demonstrate to me as an author that you could very easily regenerate your own figures, that someone else in your group that didn't work with you closely could regenerate your figures, make your model runs, do the analysis, get access to the samples, all this kind of thing. So I mention these things because they are the expectations of your scientific community, and whether or not they're sort of part of the culture of your lab or your local community, they are part of the some of the expectations that we will ask you to meet when you go to publish a paper with us. Being a part of your community also means being a good co-author. And so here I talk about it as your local community. I don't necessarily mean your lab, I just mean the people who are working on this paper with you. It should be very clear to everyone before you start writing who is going to be a co-author and who not. Of course, that can evolve over time, but if you ask someone for a figure or you ask someone to do an analysis for you and you anticipate putting that in your paper, make it clear, ideally in writing, whether that contribution constitutes co-authorship. Be a good co-author in the sense that you will communicate with all of the authors. You'll be open about it, and you'll be communicative. You'll keep those lines of communication open so that all of your co-authors know what's going on. If you agree to contribute to a paper to the level of co-authorship, it's also incumbent on you to be clear with your colleagues about other stuff you're working on. You just basically want to have all your cards on the table. Other papers you're working on, other work that you're aware of that people are doing. You want to be sort of a good collaborator in those regards. And finally, of course, I guess this is obvious, but if you agree to do something to be on a paper, then of course do it, and do it in a timely fashion. And if you are asked for revisions, then you do these things. So this is just about keeping the people around you happy as you prepare a journal submission. We're scientists, we're not writers, except that we are. And so it is tempting to think sometimes that the quality of your research will trump your ability to explain yourself. And in my experience as an editor and as an author and as a reviewer, that's just not true. And so it takes a lot of effort to write. I'm married to a journalist, I know this. But it will take you a lot of effort to write too. Anticipate that and embrace it, because the more clearly you can express yourself in writing, the better off this whole process will go. Being a good writer is sort of key to being a happy author. So I mean this both in the macro scale and in the micro scale. At the macro scale, every paper needs an idea. Every paper needs a story. Nobody cares what you did. What they want to know is what you've learned. And so your papers will be more accessible to your reviewers and to your readers if they have at least one very clear idea that a reviewer can follow from the abstract through the introduction all the way to the conclusions of the manuscript. I can't stress this often enough, and I say that partly because these are the reviews that I see that are negative. Someone says, I do not know what this person is trying to get at, or I see what this person is trying to get at, but they've included 16 other things. So have an idea, know before you start writing what that idea is. If the material doesn't contribute to that idea, don't put it in this paper. And explain things as a story. So as people, as humans, we're very attuned to the idea of storytelling. That's why stories are powerful. Make that story emerge from the writing that you do. So this is about structure. As to style, scientific writing is just writing. So you want to communicate as clearly as possible here. So the title is the first thing that people see. Think about that title, make it evocative, make it explanatory, because that is what will get people to read your abstract. So your abstract is then sort of your elevator pitch. I don't know. So that's the idea that if you're caught in the elevator going between the first and the fourth floor and you have 15 seconds to explain what your paper's about, this is what the abstract does. So probably most of your colleagues will look at a table of contents. They'll say that title looks interesting. Then they'll read the abstract. And so the abstract is your selling point. But you want it to be clear in the abstract, the sort of whole line of reasoning. Motivate the work. So explain what the problem is in the abstract. Explain in 2 lines or 2 sentences what it was you did. Explain what you learned, right? Because again, people don't care what you did, but they want to know what you've learned that they didn't know before. And explain at least a little bit of why what you learned matters. We have this idea in science that we're dispassionate, that we're above it all, but the truth of it is that, and so that leads to all kinds of sort of artificial writing, like the passive voice, this was done or that was done. Please don't do that. I say that on behalf of your readers. I say that on behalf of your reviewers. Good scientific writing is the same as good writing anywhere. And things that are particularly artificial, and particularly things that are meant to sort of highlight this dispassion and this objectivity, I think almost always lead to worse writing. And maybe one way to think about this is, write the material that you want to read. Write it in a way that you would want to read it and that your friends and your colleagues would want to read it. I said this before, but I can't say it more strongly enough. Work at that writing. It'll take a long time. One of the things that I've often had success with is as you read, as you all do, as you read through the literature, when you find a paper that you really like the writing of it, you can read it for what it says, but stop and try and take it apart a little bit and ask yourself, why do I like reading this paper? What's enjoyable? So there are some authors that have a very flamboyant voice. There are some authors who are crystal clear. There are some authors who really are sort of methodical and, you know, bring you along on their journey. Whoever it is that appeals to you, take a moment to look at ideally more than one of their papers and ask yourself what makes it a successful paper from a writing point of view. The language that you use is fundamental to how well you communicate. It is true that we are talking about ideas, but we express those ideas in words and somewhat in mathematics. And that means, I'm sorry, if English is not your first language, it will be harder for you if you're writing in English. I know, I'm sorry, but work at that. And if English is your first language, work at it too. Because, as I said, writing's hard, and there is no substitute for working and reworking and polishing and writing and rewriting until your meaning and your sense is crystal clear. Science is not advertising, and so I know that it's tempting to think that your discoveries it would be great if all our discoveries changed the world. They don't. So make measured statements about what your work means. If you've learned something which is incremental, this is how we progress, and don't claim for it more than it is. And I partly say that because reviewers and your readers will be put off if they think that you are claiming much more for your work than is supported by your evidence. Sorry. Finally, I think it's worth getting a dry run before you submit your manuscript for publication. And by this I mean, find your office mate, find your partner, find your friends, and give them your work to read. And I encourage you to get kind of a variety of viewpoints, because ideally you'd like your paper to be at least somewhat understandable, even by people who are not working in the very narrow field in which you're working. And that's partly so that you will help your work find a somewhat broader audience. When you get the feedback back, ask people to be honest with you. And when you get that feedback, listen very carefully to it. If someone comes back to you and they're your colleague, they're your office mate, or your fellow graduate student or your fellow postdoc, and they tell you that something isn't clear, it's probably not. This is really good practice for the peer review step that will happen next, is the ability to listen to people's criticisms, the ability to talk things through and understand what it is that you've said that's worked and what you've said that hasn't worked, will make this whole revision through the peer review process better. So I really encourage you to do that. A lot of labs will, a lot of institutions will sort of require this. If it's not required in your local organization, I completely encourage you to do this. Similarly, if you're in graduate school, a lot of times you'll have the opportunity to present seminars, and that's another good way to polish your writing, because the ability, the requirement to have to stand up in front of people and express yourself verbally and explain what it is you mean will often lead to a better manuscript. So take that feedback seriously. Okay, so now you have worked with your co-authors, you've written a manuscript, you've polished it, you've sent it out for your friends to read, they've worked with you, you're confident you're going to send it to AGU or to another journal. What happens? Okay, so the first thing is, again, to come back to your co-authors, if you have any. It's sort of incumbent on you to ensure that every single co-author has read the final draft, approved it, and agreed to be an author. I hope that goes without saying, but it should be clear. So everyone who's on the paper knows, has agreed, and agrees, and has agreed that you can submit that paper with their name on it. Please send your manuscript to one journal at a time. Please don't send it to more than one journal, because that's, okay, that's just the community expectation. Please don't waste people's time by sending it to more than one journal. The data, all that reproducibility stuff that we talked about 10 minutes ago, that should be prepared at publication, so it doesn't need to all be in a line when you submit, but you should be prepared that your paper might be published within 6 or 8 weeks, and so that stuff should be well on its way to fully prepared. And don't hold stuff back. I guess that also goes without saying. If you're submitting to AGU, but other publishers will have similar resources. There are authorship guidelines and instructions, and they'll sort of walk you through the process. They tend to be a little bit dry. Persevere, because they're basically a set of instructions for what to do, what format to submit the manuscript in, what tools to use, what your format your figure should be in, etc. If you have a question about a particular journal, you can always write to the editor. The editor-in-chief or any of the editors, to ask the questions. One reason you might do that is you're not quite clear whether your manuscript belongs with that journal. That's what we call the scope of the journal. What are the kinds of papers that you want to publish? And so don't send, you don't want to send a manuscript to a journal that doesn't publish that kind of work, of course. At the same time, there's a fair amount of gray area. So if you have a question, just send the title and the abstract to the editor and say, is this in question? Oh, sorry, is this in scope? You can do the same with basically any kind of question, but don't, of course, waste people's time with material with questions you might have answered from other resources. Once you're ready to submit, write a short cover letter. I mean, 3 sentences or 5 sentences is really all you need to do. And just say, here's this work. This is why we think it belongs in your journal. Before you submit the last time, spell check that manuscript, polish your language again, because now it's going off into the wilds. So you'll submit it. Oh, sorry, I did want to say something about crafting the abstract, because this is something that's almost entirely unique to scientific writing. So this is a short paragraph at the beginning. It's not, you don't want to repeat very much from the main text. It shouldn't be technical in the sense that you shouldn't have citations in there, acronyms, abbreviations, any very highly technical stuff. This explains the idea of your paper, the story of your paper. It should be accessible, but maybe not to your mom, okay, but to general readers in your field. Don't have it be full of jargon unless that jargon is sort of an integral part of your field. It would be okay to talk about climate sensitivity or aftershocks, but don't be hyper-specific in the abstract. So then there are sort of the technical things that you'll need to get squared away before you can submit it to a journal, before you can submit the stuff to a journal. One is you will need, in all likelihood, an ORCID. This is like your personal ID number for science. It's your social security number for science. You can go to this place, orcid.org, if your university hasn't already done this for you, and you get a number. And this means that we can always find Joe Smith, even if he starts changing his name to Joseph, or if someone gets married and changes their name, or if they move institutions. This is what tracks you through the course of your career. All of your data, all of your references will need to be available, not necessarily at submission, but at publication. So you don't want to be citing work that's in preparation or in progress or has been rejected. We will run your manuscript through, and this is true for all journals, through a plagiarism detection process. And this is basically web crawling just to look at all of the scientific literature, but everything else that the web holds. And if we find big chunks of text that overlap, we bounce your paper back to you. Even if you wrote a long method section in your first paper, you can't just cut and paste that and put it into the second paper. I know you wrote it the first time, but the proper thing to do there is to say, we're using the technique of this other paper, and here's 2 sentences explaining what that is. And so just know that this will happen. We sometimes find real plagiarism, but that, of course, is very rare. Once you submit the paper, we will notify every single co-author on your list. So if you didn't do that business of ensuring that all your co-authors knew they were co-authors and you were submitting, they'll find out now. And if somebody writes me back and says, oh, I didn't know I was a co-author on this paper, your paper comes immediately back to you, of course. So we will notify your co-authors. And finally, again, on this reproducibility business, for geologic samples, we will very strongly encourage you to use these IGSNs, the sample identifiers. Okay, so here's just 2 slides real quick that are in the resources that talk to you about ORCID, which is basically run by people like us, contrary to something like Researcher ID, which is run by Thomson Reuters. And here's this IGSN. So this is what gets your rocks labeled. And okay, so there you have it. So what happens now? You did your business. You wrote you did your research. You did the best job you could. You wrote this paper up. You've polished it to a high sheen. You've sent it to me. Now what? Well, here's what's going to happen. The first thing is that the journal staff, the non-technical people, will just walk through all of that list of things that I asked you, and they'll ensure that your paper is technically compliant. Everybody has an ORCID. Everybody's agreed to be on the paper, and so on. Your data is or will be available. And then we'll pass it down the review chain. So at James, for example, we have a couple of reviewers, and then we have a series of associate reviewers. The other journals are organized differently. But roughly speaking, one person will be responsible for handing it to someone with more detailed expertise in the journal, and that might go down 2 or 3 different steps until it arrives at someone on the editorial board. And so it might be an editor or an associate editor. From the author's point of view, that doesn't make a big difference. That person will be fairly well versed in your material, and they will go out and they will request some number of reviews. At AGU, it's typically 2 to 3 from your peers. We seek a broad sample from your peers. We seek young people. We seek established people. We seek men. We seek women. We seek people in the US and abroad. We really want the reviewer pool to be knowledgeable, but a representative sample of your readers. And they will make recommendations to us. And some of you have probably already done this. So the reviewer will read your paper, and they will say, ideally, hey, this makes a lot of sense. It would maybe be more clear if in section 4 you would do this or that or the other. Or they'll come back and they'll say to you, I'm sorry, I just don't understand what you're on about here. Or they'll provide you some kind of feedback. That feedback will be partly on substance, whether you are making your arguments convincingly. It will be partly on your expression. And this is one of the reasons why that polishing of your language is so important. It will partly be an assessment as to whether, it will be an assessment of the work, but also how the work is explained. And you will take, so we will take those 2 or 3 recommendations. We may read the paper ourselves and add further commentary. And then we'll come back to you and we'll say, this is what we think you need to do. Sometimes those revisions are minor, sometimes they are major, and sometimes we reject your paper. So minor revision would normally be a paper where essentially you needed to do some editorial work, redraw a figure perhaps for greater clarity, revise some text. You normally get, at AGU journals, you normally get about a week to do that. So it can't be very much. Major revisions are ones where we might be asking you, well, obviously for something more substantial. That might be a more wholesale revision of the text. It might be more simulations or further analysis. It might be more samples. It might be, but the idea there would be that the work is fundamentally sound, but it would benefit from some more extensive overhaul. That is often a 6-week window that stretches to 2 or 3 months. And then we might reject your paper. And at AGU in particular, we're very we reject about 40% of the manuscripts that come to us, but the vast majority of those we are encouraging you to resubmit. And so what I mean, the difference between rejection and encouragement to resubmit and major revisions is roughly really major revisions. And the advantage from the author's perspective is that reject and resubmit doesn't come with a timeline. So you work on this until you're happy with it, and then you send it back to us. And when you come back to us, you'll submit this revised manuscript, and depending on how significant the questions are, we might or might not send it out for another round of this same revision. Most editors will not let this go on more than about twice. They'll either reject your paper or accept it. Okay, but this is the editorial process. Peer review is hard. It's also the thing that makes our scientific process, almost unique in any sort of form of human endeavor. I would like to encourage you to think of peer review, the point of peer review, as publishing the best possible manuscripts. That's why I undertake it at James, and that's what I ask my reviewers to do and my editors to solicit, and it's what I hope you will do if you submit as an author to me. The point of the peer review is to make your paper better. If someone writes you an angry review, I might ask them actually to scale it back. But even if they've written you an angry review, there's something in there you can learn from. And so read it, go home and wail and gnash your teeth and drink a beer, and then go back and read it again. And find that thing in that negative review that was going to make your manuscript better. Similarly, I guess I would say, although I know it's not the topic of this, when you are reviewing, frame your reviews in terms of what's going to make this paper better. The people who are strict, which isn't necessarily the people who are negative, but the people who are strict are your friends. The people that are the people that hold your feet to the fire are the ones that see value in the work you're doing and want to see it come out more clearly. So embrace that. And rule number one, maybe I should have put it at the top, don't take it personally. One of the very valuable reasons I think for anonymous peer review is that you want to view your readers you want to view your reviewers as a sample of your readers. And so if something's not clear to one or more of your reviewers, it's not clear. And so don't take it personally. Don't think that George is dumb and he didn't get it because he's dumb. If someone has a criticism or a comment, then embrace it and take it to heart and revise with that in mind. So a few words of sort of advertising, because this is an AGU seminar. Why would you publish with us? Well, we're the largest Earth and Space Science publisher. We do a fair amount of open access. That means that papers are free for anyone in the world to read, basically the moment they're published. Even if you haven't paid for that or chosen to publish in one of our open access journals, everything's free after 24 months. We're large. We have a pretty good reputation, and we're very broad across the geosciences. So we have biogeochemistry and carbon, Earth, element cycling, we have climate, we have space physics, we have seismology, we have planetary stuff. We're doing more and more multidisciplinary journals, so Earth's Future, which is mostly about climate change, GeoHealth, which is about the confluence of geoscience and public health. Most of the journals strive to do reasonably rapid decision times. I know once you send it in, you want the answer next week. The very fastest journals, like geophysical research letters, normally get the answer back to you in about 3 weeks. Most journals get that back sometime between 6 and 8 weeks. It says 8 to 9, I guess. Our journal, maybe my journal's closer to 8 on average. Once the paper has been accepted, so revised, potentially re-reviewed, potentially re-revised again, but once it gets accepted, it's online and citable within a couple of days normally, and the final version is normally published within a few weeks. I know a lot of the AGU editors, we have a sort of a community meeting with all the editors-in-chief of these 20 journals. They're great. They're very plugged into their communities, and so that means that they can find you helpful and knowledgeable reviewers. Yeah, submission is easy. I guess that depends on your tolerance for our web system, but yes, it's relatively straightforward. There's 4 kinds of articles, 2 of which are probably most important for early career scientists. One of them is the normal sort of research article, and the third one on the list here is sort of a technical report or methods or data, for which we have this specialized journal called Earth and Space Science. So this is a way for you to get, if you've gone out and you've made some measurements, if you describe those measurements, and you can publish a paper that just describes those measurements, and then people who use that data will cite that paper. That's for Earth and Space Science. Okay, and finally, you know, you've sent the paper in. If finally it's accepted, it's appeared, and now you'd like people to read it. And so, Nathaniel, you were going to pose this question, right? This poll on about the use of social media, maybe or not? Oh, there it is.
Yes, launching it right now.
There it is.
So the question is, what is your primary intent when using social media with regards to your science? Is it A, to promote your own work, B, discover the work of others, or C, discover other scientists? And I'm going to close the poll in 3, 2, 1, and closing it now. And the result, it looks like 61% use social media to discover the work of others, and then an even 20% each use social media primarily to promote their own work or to discover other scientists.
Okay, great. So social media, as you are already experiencing it, is a great way to sort of promote your own work. So obviously you'll tweet about some paper that you've just written. I think it helps a lot, and I think this helps for a lot of reasons, to write what's a plain language summary. So this is the summary that you can send to your mom, where basically you try and explain, you know, the importance of what you did. Again, this like the abstract, but even less technical. Your university's press office will probably love that. If your work is particularly noteworthy and your more senior collaborators are likely to be able to give you good advice about this, then everybody wants to hear about it. Your university's press office, the AGU, your funding agency. The AGU has this sharing science program that they do, where they will help you learn to talk about science with civilians. I have just been through that. I had a very high visibility paper earlier this year where that training came in enormously valuable. So you'll post on social media, you'll sign up for this kudos thing, which is, again, sort of this plain language. And then AGU has some other toolkits they have some other resources in this toolkit that will help you sort of raise your visibility. Again, I would sort of say you don't want to raise it, you know, in the same way that you don't want to hype your results overly much in your paper. You want to sort of calibrate exactly how much exposure you want. But the people who are working in your same field certainly want to know when you've done something interesting. So that's it, I think. That's all I have to say. I'm sorry I was not so polished. I haven't done this before, but I'm happy to take any of your questions at this point.
Yeah. Thanks, Rob. The presentation was great, actually. I already have a few questions in the question box, but I'll give everybody a few moments to finish their thoughts. And while they do that, I just want to point out, for anybody that liked this webinar or liked the one last week that we had on the peer review process, we have another publications one coming up next week. Next Thursday, it's creating figures for your scientific posters. Though it's specifically figures for posters, it applies to papers that you're submitting as well. So anybody looking for more of a better technical understanding of how to put those figures together should join us next week at 2 p.m. Eastern. And let me take a look to see what questions we have. Looks like we have quite a bit of time.
Is it your screen up now, or is my screen
up? Your screen's still up.
Okay.
And we can just leave it up there with the question slide. Fine.
Okay.
So the first question that I have for you is, what are the general guidelines for listing order of co-authors and designating a senior author?
That depends. That's sort of very culturally sensitive. So in Europe, for example, where I often work, the senior author is normally the last. Sometimes here it would be the second. This is something you need to work out. One thing that people work out among your co-author team is the way I would say it. Normally, the first person is the person who did the majority of the work and or wrote most of the paper. This is something you would negotiate. One thing that often happens is that the people who contributed most substantially would be in some order at the beginning, and then, for example, if a bunch of different people all provided data or provided simulations, they might be listed alphabetically at the end. But I think that ordering is something you want to work out with your co-authors, because there's not a hard and fast rule across cultures how to read that.
Great. All right. The next one I have here is regarding plagiarism. The question is, regarding plagiarism, what about using the same text in a scientific publication that was used in a thesis manuscript that may be published on a university website?
Oh, that's a really good question. I think that if it has not been, so what AGU considers publication, most publishers, is something that's been given what's called a DOI, and this is like your ORCID, except it applies to particular papers. So every published journal article gets a unique identifier, and your thesis will not have such an identifier, and so it's okay to copy from your thesis. Also, the expectation is normally that, of course, that your thesis, that the publication is separate from your thesis. So that's just fine.
Okay, great, good. So the next one I've got here is a question regarding, you mentioned artificial writing, and you were kind of quick about it. You were talking about the difference between passive versus active voice, and the person wanted to know if you had a longer / more specific example that you could give.
Well, I just mean, if you are talking about going out into the field and collecting samples, and you're talking to your friends, you say, well, I went out into the field and I dug around under these rocks and I found this. So you wouldn't say, a field expedition was made and rocks were collected, and right? So the passive voice is where things were done, things happened. And the active voice is where I did this. So of course the paper's not about you, but that distinction between the sort of, but it can be written such that, we analyze the data, or the data show that, rather than, this happened, that happened. I don't know if that's clear. It's a very good
I think that you used a few better examples. Yeah, you were pretty quick there when you initially said it. But yeah, the basic idea is that it's a tough line to straddle between the narrative voice, which a lot of abstract descriptions are moving towards, and like maintaining the old guard of very dry scientific language. And as you said, good scientific writing is the same as good writing anywhere. So it's just keeping that in mind and kind of evolving your writing style to reflect that.
If I could indulge myself in a little anecdote, I have a friend who won a Pulitzer Prize for food writing, and which is harder than it sounds. And he writes all his articles by saying, I did this and I did that and I did this. And then he goes back and he takes all of himself out of it. And it's a fascinating process to watch, because he's shown me drafts. But just the point is that, but his articles are very lively nonetheless. Obviously, he won a Pulitzer. And so I think just just that idea that you want it to sound as natural as possible, just because that's easier to read, right? The ideas are already hard, right? Because we have to think hard about what we do. So the ideas are already hard. Don't make the language get in the way of that.
Mm-hmm. All right, yeah, so the next one I've got, it's for early career scientists in particular, and I think that I might be seeing a theme here. I know it's kind of a hot topic. Deciding and navigating who is a co-author and expectations of co-author, particularly with those more senior, is tough. Do you have any examples of what worked well for other author groups?
It's hard for me to say that from the outside. Well, again, you know, people have different expectations, and I think you have to navigate them. AGU has this thing called the connected community, and if you're an AGU member, you have access to some of this. And I am happy to provide, there's been some really interesting discussions of co-authorship on this. And what you take away from those is that it really depends. In my own view, in my own experience, the person who funded you would not necessarily be a co-author, but often the person that funds you is talking to you and working with you and helping you to develop your ideas. I certainly published even as a graduate student without my PhD advisor when I was working with other people or on my own. At the same time, of course, I don't want you to get in trouble by making someone irritated. I mean, my own rough view on that is if someone's ideas are reflected in the paper, even if you just had lengthy conversations with them, or they contributed in a substantive way by writing or by providing data or figures or analyses, then this is normally what makes for co-authorship. I recognize that it's hard, and I recognize that I'm being a little weaselly, and I apologize for that. I think that the danger there is that if you violate some cultural norm, even just in your group, the repercussions can be pretty bad. And so of course you don't want to do that, and at the same time you want people's contributions to be clear. So I'm afraid I don't have an easy answer.
I don't think that there is an easy answer. I think that that's a pretty fair and honest one, though. But I would say to the person that asked that, and you brought it up already, the connect.agu.org has been having a lot of these conversations, and all it really requires is to have AGU login. At this point, I don't even think that it's gated to members only. So if you get in now while it's still in beta, if you're not a member, you can join in on those conversations. I got another one here, and you may not know this. You might have to go digging later. But the person wants to know: are there requirements for sharing code for statistical analysis and/or figures? It's one thing to have to make your data open, but if you had to do coding to get that data, you also have to make the coding open.
That's the spirit of what we're asking for. I recognize, I write my own code. I recognize that most of it should never see the light of day. At the same time, so if, for example, in climate science, there are these huge collections of simulation data that people use from the climate model intercomparison projects. There are these huge pieces of simulation data, and people often publish papers that are that show statistics from those. Would you have to publish your scripts? Maybe not, right? If the idea is I took the average across these models and found the following thing, no, you probably don't have to. You probably don't have to provide that code. If, on the other hand, you did a simulation with a climate model, I would want that either that the output from that climate model is available, or that the climate model itself is available and the scripts necessary to run it. So it's a little bit of a fine line. It certainly is probably good for you to be able to distribute your code, in part because I promise you that 6 months from now, when you go back to try and build on it, it'll be a lot easier if you've cleaned it up and packaged it. So, you know, you want to approach the spirit of this business of reproducibility without getting too hung up on the details, is maybe the way to say it.
Mm-hmm.
At least that's how we do it in my journal, I should say.
Fair enough. All right. So the next one, let's see. Tips. Do you have any tips on choosing potential reviewers for your cover letter? And how does this work from the editor's perspective? Do you always choose from the suggestions, or do you maybe choose others?
It's a very really good question. So as this questioner asks, you know, we have you are allowed to suggest reviewers when you submit your paper, and in fact we ask you to do that. Different people are different. Every editor is different. Some of us will absolutely go through that list. So if you're working in a field, most of the people who you suggest are probably known to the editors because we're working in your field, but it never hurts. Certainly if you have younger people we might not be aware of, that's terrific because you help us discover them. Some people will go through that list. Nobody's going to just walk down your list and say, oh, I'm going to take, you know, reviewer 1 and 3 off this person's list, right? We're always going to do some vetting, and we're always going to find people you didn't suggest, I think it's fair to say. But no, I think you're looking for people who can comment knowledgeably and impartially on your work. That's really all. And maybe one thing to say is that, you know, don't tell me that Albert Einstein should be a reviewer of your paper, because I mean that in the generic sense, right? Don't tell me that the single leading light of your field should be the reviewer of that paper, because everybody wants that person, right? Tell me somebody I don't know about who has somebody who has a point of view that will be valuable.
Great. Let's see. So the next one I have, could you explain the virtues or vices in going for a journal submission or a preprint server? Any perspectives on the journal versus preprint dilemma?
Oh,
yeah. Thanks for a wonderful and informative session.
Oh, well, thank you. I hope it was useful. Preprint servers, AGU is now going to establish a preprint server for the geosciences. These are not, it's not either or. That is to say, you are welcome to submit to arXiv or to our preprint server, and that does not preclude journal submission. Normally, what you would do is once the paper's published, you point, I guess, the link at the preprint server to the published paper, but it's not mutually exclusive. And in fact, you know, I believe that AGU says that if you have sent something to us, you are welcome to host the submitted version on your own website or make it available how you like. So I don't think that's either or. I think that's yeah, either use arXiv or one of the AGU servers. There is a potential disadvantage. So some of the journals published, for example, by the European Geophysical Union have these discussion papers. And so what happens is you submit the paper, the peer review process is open, and if the paper's rejected, it still sits. It never gets promoted to the full journal, but it still sits there as a discussion paper. That, unfortunately, counts as prior publication because those things have a DOI. So be careful.
Mm-hmm. Okay, the next one I have, this is kind of in your opinion as an editor, what are your thoughts on the use of appendices rather than large methods sections to explain methodology? These methods may be new and important, but also could just be an aside to the main science story that you want to tell.
That's another great question. I think that good writing tells a story. I think that if it's a paper where you need a very long discussion of how you did something, but that's not the main idea of the paper, then by all means put it in appendix. Put it in supplementary material, right? If it was hard to do something, but what you learned from it is the interesting part, then explain the interesting part in the paper, and put the difficult machinery somewhere else. Yes, in the appendix or in supplementary material.
Great. All right. Just a few more here. How and for how long should I make my data available? If my institution doesn't hold a web service for that purpose, will I provide an email address so I will make my data available for those who contact me?
So that's another great question. We don't like this, please contact me for the data, because mostly people don't. There was a terrific piece in the AGU Vox by Peter Brewer from the Monterey Bay Aquarium about this, where he asked for geophysical data. He's a blue water oceanographer, and he asked for some geophysical data, and basically nobody that he asked for it gave it to him. So there are now, with this push towards more accessibility, there are now greater and greater opportunities. So there are archives like Zenodo, Zenodo, which is run by CERN, that will archive your data for you. Not petabytes probably, but lots of it. And so that's probably preferable. They'll even give you a DOI for your data. And that's probably preferable to putting it on your personal web server. So okay. This copdesk.org will be a good resource for you there.
I'm actually going to make sure that I highlight that when I add the slides at the end of this. Okay, got two more questions. The last one, many authors have the story of reviewer number 3, the unusually harsh and not constructive person who attacks the premise, etc., and so on, without actually providing anything constructive. How does the AGU editorial board weigh the various reviews, and what are the best practices in terms of responding to such a reviewer as an author? Okay. We're all people. Every editor takes this on differently. I sometimes reject reviews if they're just too negative. I don't see that that's helping. Sometimes I'll go back and say, these points are valid, but you're being mean. Please don't do it like that. If your editor's not, so the person who makes the decision is the editor. The reviewers provide advice to the editors. And so the person you need to convince is the editor and not the reviewer. At the same time, we've gone out to those reviewers and we've asked them for their advice because they've got some knowledge. If it's just negative, if there's nothing to respond to, there's nothing to respond to. And of course you want to be solicitous and polite and professional and respectful. But if someone hasn't given you a sort of something that you can do to make the paper better and make them not grumpy, then there's nothing you can do. You can also, by the way, you can always go back and forth with the editor, right? If you read reviewer number 3 and they're just a pile of vitriol, there's no harm in going back to the editor and saying, hey, I don't quite know how to respond to this. I see that reviewer number 1 says I ought to do this, and reviewer number 2 says I ought to do that, and I'm happy to do that, but I'm not quite sure how to make reviewer number 3 happy. The editor, hopefully, will provide you guidance there. What seems important to me about this is, this aspect of what they're saying. It's fundamentally, I guess I would say, it's a human process, right? So we have guidelines for things like reproducibility, data availability, right? How to respond to reviewers, but there's people back there, all of us. And so there's no harm in coming to us and saying, this is what I'm, this is my question for you. Okay, great. Well, it looks like we're actually hitting the 3 o'clock mark now. So I want to respect everybody's time here. If I didn't get to your question, I'll be sure to either answer it myself online or pass it along to Robert. But I want to thank everybody again, and thank you again, Robert, for giving this wonderful presentation. The recording is going to be available probably either later this afternoon or tomorrow for anybody interested in that. Yeah.
Great. Thanks for joining.
Yeah. Thank you, Robert. Everybody have a wonderful rest of your afternoon.